Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thank you for attending the session. I think, of course, last year was the 50th anniversary of the Durban strikes, which was, of course, one of the most well-publicized and dramatic episodes of labor history in the country. And therefore, I think that it is, of course, of great importance to revisit the Durban strikes and to review what was said and what was done during that time. And let me just put my presentation on here. Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Let's see. Okay, there we go. Okay, let me just move this out of the way. Oh. Oops. All right. Let me get back to that slide first. Yeah, I think that clearly that it was a very significant episode in the history of the country, led to the revival of the labor movement, which ultimately led or played a leading role in the ending of the apartheid system within the country. What was striking about these strikes was the explosive character of the strikes, centered and concentrated largely around Durban, but also, in effect, had a national character, which I'll speak about later on. The third important aspect of this moment, sometimes called and referred to as the Durban moment, was that, in effect, it bewildered everyone, trying to understand what had transpired, what allowed for such a great explosion of labor, and all political parties from the state and others, political organizations, student organizations, trade unions, business leaders, and academics were all baffled by the character of this labor explosion and tried to understand the phenomenon of this mass strike. In fact, really few of those commentating at the time really fully grasped the deep socioeconomic, socio-historical processes that was unfolding. In effect, progressive academics have provided a limited explanation of the causes and organizational dimensions of the strike, which became shrouded in mystery. And I think here in particular, we found that the conclusion of a major study by the Institute for Industrial Education had basically made a conclusion that these strikes were basically spontaneous. After trying to examine which agents played an active role in leading this uprising, it couldn't find a definitive agent, and then concluded that we had then an spontaneous explosion. Now, when one concludes something spontaneous, is rather vague, and it leaves out the details of what transpired historically within that process. Of course, one can then document what happened in that year, but one is then unable to explain the historical dynamic and circumstances that led to such an explosion. And this, for me, is some of the key limitations of the scholarship in the period and why they could not explain the mystery or fully explain the mystery of the Durban strikes. The first and most important aspect was that there was a mistaken belief that the period of the 60s was a period of acquiescence of labor. In other words, that labor no longer played an active role in resisting its conditions of work. And that meant basically that intellectuals then discarded a study of labor for the period of the 60s and started basically anew from the 70s in the examination of what had transpired during the 1973 strike explosions. What this limitation resulted in was that the fact that if the scholars were not able then to examine struggles in the 1960s, examine how workers resisted or ignored how workers resisted the oppression and exploitation in the different industrial sectors, they therefore could not explain the prominence of textiles and clothing and the leading role of women in the Durban strikes of 1973. A further key point that I'd like to make is that without examining the clustering of technological change and innovation and generalized cost-cutting in the labor process, which accelerated in the mid-1960s, the effects of which created long-standing grievances amongst workers, existing scholarship could not explain the magnitude, the size of these strikes. And finally, and very importantly, was that descriptions of the strikes, whether in the media, whether in academic text, almost entirely used the gender-neutral term worker to examine or describe how the strikes were taking place. In other words, it created a certain invisibility of who the chief actors were during that time. I've also come across, of course, the feminist literature on studying the 70s period. While I think that there, of course, is a significant contribution to understanding the leading role of women in the trade unions of the 70s, the limitation was that because the strikes were not led by trade unions in 1973, the strikes and the actors were actually, the women who were leading or acting in the strikes were not studied as well. And so there was then a continued invisibility of women and their role in 1973, despite these contributions. And I think where feminist scholars made an amazing contribution to understanding the structural changes in the economy and the changes to the labor process, particularly in the textiles and clothing industries in the 60s, they nevertheless did not pay attention to worker resistance in these industries. In fact, it's mentioned almost in passing. And I think that here, once again, I think that the idea of labor acquiescence was so dominant that it kind of filtered through the whole of academia, that it was just a generalized belief. And so not taking really labor resistance seriously in the 1960s. Now, one of the key limitations of the scholars at the time was that they were basically basing their ideas on the very, very limited statistics provided by the government at that time, the government and business, which was very, I think, highly fallible in terms of giving an impression. And so this helped to, these statistics helped to, in a sense, consolidate an understanding of labor acquiescence. And so what I've done really was to kind of relook at this period, dig up the statistics, review statistics, and came up with a completely different picture of what that is like on a statistical level. And what we see really, the trend line for the blue line really represents the trend line for strikes, and it shows that the trend line is up from the 50s and continues into the 60s and up to the 70s. What is significant about the period of the 50s is actually, it's a period of major struggles in the sphere of reproduction. It is the awakening of the ANC as a mass movement and broader societal mobilization. And of course, the workers' movement plays its role in the mass tailways, and that to some extent accounts for the high rate of strikes we can see here peaking in the 1950s. However, with the bannings by 1960, the 1960 of the political parties, that kind of political mobilization in the reproductive sphere retracts, right? And that is, I think, why there was this notion that there is a period of acquiescence, right? So in a sense, there was a mistake, basically a mistaken belief that because we could no longer see struggle happening at community level, therefore it wasn't happening really anywhere else. But the data tells a different story. As we can see, there are several peaks in strikes, 1961, 1964, 1966, 1969, and by 1972, there's an upturn again. What is remarkable actually is that the days lost to production in the 1960s is higher than that reached in the 1950s. And that tells us that workers' resistance or their persistence to win their demands is higher than it was in the 1950s, right? And what happens here? Basically, the 1961 stay away is a response to the Sharpeville massacre. There is a political assembly of the National Party and the white establishment to discuss what is happening in terms of the labor movement. They immediately go into action and say, well, this is a dangerous trend, and we'll have to do something about this, because the worry was that the labor movement during the 60s would basically accelerate in terms of its resistance to not only oppression in the workplace, but also in terms of apartheid in general. And similarly, we can see the same thing happening in 1964. And I'll come to explain what happens during these strikes. And then we can see also in terms of the number of strikes, the gray line, that there is a peak in 1971 prior to the other strikes that unfolded in 1972. But the strikes in 1971 actually don't appear in the historical works of the labor movement. Now, just to make the graph simpler, this is basically what it meant in terms of the study of strikes for that period. In fact, we can see that the average number of strikes have actually increased in the 60s. Days lost production also increased. But here's an interesting point, that the number of strikers are actually lower, although this is double the figure than the established count in the labor history literature that I've been able to count. But there's a very specific reason of why that count of strikers is lower. As I indicated, that there was an unnerving feeling by the state and business in 1961 that something bigger was going to happen in the country, noting that they banned the political parties. There was the, of course, Sharpeville massacre, and there would be consequences. And they immediately stepped in and passed 18 wage determinations, minimum wage determinations for unskilled workers over a period of 5 years in an attempt to quell resistance on the shop floor. The second thing they did was to employ larger numbers of what they called then native labor officers to intervene timelessly into worker resistance on the shop floor and try and reach settlements in the workplace without striking. And on an average, when I was looking at the literature, was that you would have about between 50 and 88 strikes being prevented from happening per annum with the interventions of these native labor officers. So there was a serious resistance happening on the shop floor. Now, the other thing was who was actually striking in the 60s? That's the other thing. And it's a very interesting study done by Shane and Foreman, which I think they were from the HSLC. And they did a study of female and male strikers in the different industries. I couldn't get all the data from this, but just did the graph. And what I decided to do was to superimpose the two graphs to give us a clearer picture of peaks in terms of the male and the female industries. Now, what is very interesting here is that, the female industries peaked before the male-dominated industries during the 60s. In other words, so the female industries peaked between 1962, 1963, 1965, 1967, 1970, and 1971, whereas the male industries or male-dominated industries peak after in every period. So the male industries peak 1965, 1969, and 1972, right? Now, what does this tell us? It tells us basically that in the female-dominated industries, there was higher resistance, or at least they were playing actually a leading role in initiating the strike movements during the period of the 1960s. Continuing over here now, example of just kind of disputing the notion of acquiescence in the 1960s. This is kind of 1963, the Garment Workers Union hotel strike. As you can see, this is a very well organized strike by 13,000 workers, mainly Indian workers from the hotel, and the entire union is mobilized to provide support for the strike. In 1964, we have similar huge strikes in the textiles in New Germany, Benoni. And what is interesting on these strikes is that the main demands of strikes are about the new shift systems, which was moved from 8 hours to 11 hours. So that runs and cuts across all those kinds of strikes that happened those periods. Now, there are many strikes. It's even a period of where you have a Bata shoe factory, where there's a Luddite moment, and they're smashing 16 new machines that have come in. So there's a lot of information out there of the different kinds of resistance that took place during the 1960s, but we don't have the time to go through all of them. But what is clear is that where industries where women had a significant presence or were dominant played a leading role in terms of initiating strikes. And now, by the time we reached 1971, we have a very interesting moment. We have the 1971 Natal clothing workers strike. This is a massive strike. You can see the bias of the media because they refer to 6,000 of the workers who were locked out, but there's a small wording of the 22,000 workers in the second paragraph. You see that this on the right is a picture of a rally of 22,000 workers, basically largely Indian workers, female workers who led these strikes or basically take up seat. Now, what is very interesting in none of the labor history texts is this strike mentioned, except for those, of course, written in more recent times. There is a mention of this, but the original text, none mention these texts, either from the 70s, even the early 80s contributions do not mention this. Now, my argument here is that 1971 is actually the labor turning point and not 1973. And the reason for that is clear. In order to understand a labor turning point, we have to look at two measures. How distinctive is it on a quantitative level, and how distinctive is it on a qualitative level? And what we find here is that the number of workers on strike was last seen, this number of 22,000, in the 1940s. Right? So that's the one kind of quantitative way of looking at understanding when workers reach a qualitatively new moment has reached. The second aspect of this strike was the fact that it was the first regional garment strike that took place. So there was a really high level of organization involved after the 1960s period, and I think the 1950s period. The agreement, the 3-year agreement, was far-reaching, right? Not only did workers receive a 20% increase, they gained overtime pay on Saturdays, and also their paid leave was increased from 12 to 14 days. I don't think the other workers in 1973 even achieved what these workers achieved during this period. So this was a significant breakthrough in terms of the period and the timing in which this strike actually then takes place. And fascinating, we then continue this strikes that starts in 1971. There are, of course, other strikes there as well, continues into 1972. And amazingly, it is the Black Consciousness Journal Black Review that documents the strikes of 1972 in quite detail. And what then is clear is that the mobilization from 1971 continues into 1972, escalates, and days lost production doubles in that year. And of course, we have prominent strikes. There's the Patco bus strike, the Stevenson strikes in Cape Town harbors, the Weavers' and Spirit strike in Benoni, and then the 1,500 strong night watchman strike, which only concludes on the 1st of January, 1973. And that's very important, okay? Now, here again, what is significant running thread here is that these strikes are about working conditions, mainly changing of working conditions, hours of work. The bus drivers, it was about long new routes that they had to work for the same amount of pay. And secondly, for example, the ticket system had changed from the conductor on the bus to the driver taking the money. And that was an added responsibility. The Steve Go strikes, of course, was the increase in the working hours of week by, I think, another 20 hours for the week. Similarly with the night watchman as well, including the wages. So working conditions was really primary in terms of the resistance during 1972. And when we come to 1973, right, we therefore must see that the coronation strike was really a continuation and not the beginning of the strike wave that occurred in 1973. And rather that it was directly linked to the last strike happening in January, being resolved and continuing into the early period. And that this strike was not the initiator of a new cycle of struggle. My argument is it was the 1971 clothing workers that was the initiator of the struggle cycle. Now, of course, the number of establishments for clothing and textiles, of course, was significant and was the highest for the period. But the Johannesburg strike was often missed out in understanding just the extent of women involvement. And the article by Berger of 1983, the first time I actually saw this in all the literature, actually raises the point and says, well, there was 21 strikes happening in Johannesburg after a retreat of struggles in the Durban industries, because the Durban started to recede by March, and basically Johannesburg took over from March to April, another wave of strikes. And so here we have additional evidence to show the extent of female-dominated industries on strike. Right. So what we have now really is that textiles and clothing had the highest count in terms of the number of establishments, not the number of workers for that period. The second thing was that because of the clustering of large-scale industries within what was called industrial complexes, that allowed for a pre-organization of workers in large numbers, and what I call it provided the locational elasticity for the rapid spread of the strikes. And of course, these strikes actually had a very sophisticated level of organization, and that's why I can't really conclude that they were spontaneous, or at least I use the term spontaneous self-organization to make that clear, much more clearer of what we are referring. And it was a much higher level of organization reached by the working class, I think, since the 1940s. Importantly, what is left out of this research, and I think hopefully we'll have some future research, is that it is obvious that the members of these clothing and textile workers played a critical role in leading these strikes, even though they did that without the unions. But of course, the newspaper reports and other reports don't give us that kind of evidence. But what is interesting is that the Black Review, once again, documents these strikes, and in fact is one of the only publications that I think at least try to make a reference to women in describing who was involved in those strikes. And I found that very, very fascinating and very, very interesting. But the point really is for us now is how do we actually explain this explosion that occurred in 1973? How do we explain the magnitude of workers coming together in complexes and striking more or less at the same time in different industries? Now, an article by Sam Nhlongo in the New Left Review was actually the first to provide an analysis of the structural dynamics that allowed for such uprisings to occur, both in Namibia and in South Africa. It's a beautifully written piece. I would recommend that you do read it. It is, I think, should have been a classic in terms of understanding the 1973 strikes. And he makes a really a very important contribution. And his basic argument is that to understand this massive resistance of the working class, you have to understand structural changes which have taken place in settler economies, which altered the context of the opposition movement. And here in particular, he is referring to the fact, firstly, that in 1968, manufacturing overtook mining as the lead sector in the economy, that what you had also is that because of this change, there had to be a change in the racial division of labor. And so black workers were brought into the fold, and this expanded the size of the black proletariat and bringing them into semi-skilled and skilled positions in the workplace, which for him basically was the primary reason for why you could argue about the size of the explosion. My response to that is, I think that's a limited explanation, because the size of the Durban strikes was basically the same as that took place in 1920, the black miners, and in the 1946, in terms of the actual numbers, round about 100,000, right? Of course, he argues also, of course, that the inflationary pressure, which is important always in any strike, was a very important contributing factor, which I agree, but it cannot in itself explain the size and the magnitude of the strikes, because if that was the case, we'd be having that kind of sizes of strikes almost every year, right? Because of inflationary kinds of pressure. But what is interesting is that the textile and clothing industries in Cottle is the fastest growing industry within manufacturing. It is the lead employer of workers in the period of the 70s. And so there's a very specific character for me in terms of what allowed for textiles and clothing to play the kind of lead role that it did by 1973. And to understand this change, we have to go to the mid-1960s, where there was, through the general decline in the rate of profit by 1964, the rate of profit starts to decline and capital starts to look at cost-cutting measures and to implement cost-cutting throughout industry. And what happened here specifically is that new cost-cutting technologies were employed, and there were changes to the labor process employed at the same time. And according to Freud, in terms of his work, that there was a kind of real effort in terms of making these changes throughout all industries, starting from the 60s. And this is where we had, of course, the feminization, a great drive for the feminization of labor in South Africa, and with the automation in the textile industry. Our argument here is essentially that the pace of technological change was higher and faster in textiles than in the other industries, and I'll kind of explain that later on. But anyway, here are just three examples of three different industries. We can see that there were, in fact, there were these kinds of changes being made, and they were all starting to act in unison to make these kinds of technological changes and changes to the labor process. Very interesting. The Coronation Brick and Towel Company in Durban introduced automation in 1972, prior to the 1973 strikes. The other indicator of what tells me that the automation was faster implemented in textiles was that it had the lowest number of unskilled workers compared to all the other industries, which I think was, and the highest percentage of skilled workers compared to all industries at the time, and had made very early measures to kind of increase productivity throughout that period. So what is happening then in industry from the 60s is that these changes of technological changes and changes in the labor process then becomes generalized and cuts across all industries by the time we reach 1973. Okay? And finally, I'm arguing that because of the leading role that this change has played within textiles, which you could see from the data I showed, this explains the continuum of how then the worker resistance or women played the leading role in the Durban strikes of 1973. Now, I'm coming close to my conclusion. The interesting thing about this study by Farman is that it ranked kind of the demands of workers from, or the issues from workers from highest to lowest. And in here, basically ranked working conditions as the primary grievance of workers. And so that working conditions allows them for the long-standing grievance around the working time. So in the final analysis, I'm arguing that the causes of this mass strikes was therefore rooted in the labor process, right? And technological change. And that these gave rise then to the long-standing grievances of which coalesced across the industries by the time we reached 1972. We can clearly see that there's a clear alignment in terms of the nature of workers' grievances and the changes that took place in industry. And when the opportunity came, which was the upswing of 1972 to 1974, the trigger of which I agree with Mhlongo was that the trigger for that then was inflationary pressures during that period. In conclusion, it was a combination of economic upswing, implementation of labor-saving technologies, changes to the labor process that have become generalized by 1971, 1972, that in turn set up resistance on the shop floor that explains the magnitude of the Durban strikes of 1973. Secondly, that the leading role of women in the textile and clothing industries as initiator of the new cycle of the class struggle was so profound that the reverberations paved the way for the apartheid state finally to give legal recognition in 1979 to the establishment of an independent Black trade union movement in South Africa. Thank you.